Welcome to the Napoleonicist and a happy new year to you all. I've got an absolute riot of an episode to start with this year as we discuss Chatham, Walcheren and the nutter, that is a technical term, the nutter Popham. This is an interview I've been looking forward to for ages because I am joined by Jacqueline Reiter. Many of you will know her from Twitter. She is just a genius in terms of taking her research and making everybody howl with laughter, whilst also being kind of the font of all knowledge on questions of patronage, politics, the Walcheren expedition, and a certain pompous prat by the name of Sir Home Popham. Jacqueline wrote the acclaimed biography, The Late Lord Chatham, The Life of John Pitt, 2nd Earl Chatham, and it's brilliant to finally have her on the Napoleonicist for a one-to-one interview. Jacqueline, I can't believe it's taken me so long to do this. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you, and no problem. It's very exciting to be here, really.
Let's start with Chatham, first of all. Most listeners won't know much about him unless they've read your book, which they obviously should do. So give us a brief rundown of his life and significance during this period.
Well, I'm not surprised most people don't know much about him. He's not exactly the most famous member of his family. He was the eldest son of William Pitt the Elder, 1st Earl of Chatham. He was born in 1756, which makes him 2.5 years older than his more famous younger brother, William Pitt the Younger. He had a dual career in military and in politics, which makes him gold dust for me because I love the interplay between military and politics. He's of course most famous or infamous for bungling the Walcheren expedition of 1809. So he hasn't exactly gone down in history as the best military commander. He hasn't gone down in history as the best politician either. So kind of eclipsed by his family members, but nevertheless served in some very important positions. He was First Lord of the Admiralty at the beginning of the wars against France. He was also Master General of the Ordnance for 9 years, which makes him pretty important, really.
Well, yeah, absolutely. Is this somebody who kind of achieves what he does because of patronage, or is there genuine ability there, or is it a fusion of the two?
Well, he definitely got his appointments because of who he was, not because of what he did. That doesn't mean he was a complete idiot, by no means. He was no member of the Pitt family was a complete idiot, not a single one of them. And he was very intelligent. He just wasn't very hardworking. His nickname was the Late Lord Chatham, not because he was dead, but because he was always late. I played on that on the title of my book, which is called The Late Lord. And I was kind of hoping when I researched the book to be able to undermine that myth a little bit, but no, he lived up to it completely, 100%. So that has definitely coloured the way people have looked at him, and deservedly so. He entered the cabinet because his brother wanted him to help him, essentially, to sort of buttress his side of the argument. He stayed in the cabinet partly because Pitt was too embarrassed to get rid of him after he brought him in. But then he kind of got his own traction, partly because of mainly because of his name, but also because he kind of became, particularly after Pitt's death, he became a figure that the Pittites could rally around, potentially, because he was unquestionably a connection to Pitt, who died in 1806, so I'm talking about the post-1806 period here. And that gave him a lot of clout that he didn't have before, necessarily.
So, I mean, there are so many questions to ask straight away, aren't they? Let's go back to the late Lord thing, first of all. Why is he always late? Is it just that he doesn't own a watch, or is he spending his evenings getting drunk and therefore he's got a kind of stinking hangover the following morning? Where does it come from?
Well, I think it's very unlikely he didn't own a watch. I think he just ignored them. The thing about the drinking, that's an interesting one, because he did have there were rumours flying that he was a bit of a hard drinker, and as the brother of Pitt the Younger, this shouldn't be surprising to anyone. Pitt the Younger was a famously a 4-bottle-a-day man. I don't know how many bottles Chatham drank. I did read the inventory of his cellars, which was taken after he died, and I can tell you that as an 80-odd man, he had a very full cellar. But I don't know how much of that was actually influencing his job. I think he was genuinely just a very laid back sort of person. You can find this if you look at him as a child. Even his parents are saying things like, "Oh, he really does well when you push him." That's not a direct quote; it's a paraphrase, but you can find things like that in their letters. So clearly, even as a child, he was already a little bit inclined to pedal back on the work and do other stuff that he'd rather be doing. And I don't think anyone really pulled him up on it. Particularly after he became Earl of Chatham, I think he just got used to just getting his own way in that respect. And even when he was in cabinet, I think rather than try and change him, some of his underlings just went with it. And but that doesn't mean he was completely incapable, because a lot of it, what you find if you look at a lot of the people who were working closely with him, surprisingly, you find all of them saying things like, "Oh gosh, he's really quite sharp," and he actually stamps his mark on the departments that he's working in. So when he resigned briefly in 1806 after his brother died as Master General of the Ordnance, one of the outgoing, one of his subordinates who went out with him, said something that quite surprised me, which is, "The person I regret most is Lord Chatham and his system." You don't get that much in histories of the ordnance of the period. In fact, you get quite the opposite, the sense that Chatham did nothing at all, but clearly this isn't true. And that's kind of the story I wanted to tell in my biography.
Is he effectively that really annoying person that we all came across at secondary school, who's so good that they don't need to bother about 90% of the time and they still ace their exam? Is he kind of a 19th century political equivalent of one of those?
I think you might have hit the nail on the head there, actually. There was one quote which is rolled out almost all the time when people are talking about Chatham, which is Lord Eldon. I can't remember when he wrote it. I think it might have been in the 1820s. He said that the person who struck him the most in cabinet meetings was Lord Chatham, because he'd just sit there in complete silence, kind of apparently asleep. And then he'd say something and it would be so apposite that everyone would go, "Whoa, where have you been?" I think that's just the way he was. You know, he looked and behaved sometimes like he was quite unimportant and sort of in the background, but he was always listening, he was always there. And my goodness, if you crossed him, I wouldn't have wanted to be his enemy. I suspect he had a very long list of people that he wanted to get even with as well. And I'm not painting a very nice picture of him, but I actually quite like him, as you know.
Is this intellect something that runs in the family? Because Pitt the Younger is meant to have been an incredibly sharp, almost kind of genius level individual, isn't he?
Well, there's no doubt that Pitt the Younger was the brains of that generation, and as opposed to his brother John, Pitt had to be restrained from working too hard as a child, whereas John had to be pushed. Pitt had to be sort of held back. So they had very different personalities right from the start there. There is a sense that Chatham had the edge on Pitt in certain respects. Apparently he was much better at maths than Pitt as a child. I don't know if that carried on into adulthood. Certainly when they were doing, when their private tutor was recording how well they did, Chatham nearly always got full marks, whereas Pitt was kind of more middling. And I also, by the way, sneakily get the feeling that Chatham was his tutor's favourite. Throughout life, not just as a child. But I think it would be very difficult to say that Chatham was more intelligent than Pitt. I think he was definitely not. And I think that may have had some impact on his temperament as well. I think there was on the one side, I think he saw that Pitt was going to take on the family mantle, and he was kind of very happy to stand back and let him do that. But I think it must also have been very hard knowing that your younger brother is outshining you in almost everything except maths. So I can kind of see how that could have contributed to his laid back persona, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, completely. Almost a sort of cover, oh, I'm not really fussed anyway, and by having that ability to kind of make people go, whoa, what was that? It kind of shields you a little bit, doesn't it? Because, people could just kind of go, oh, well, if he really put the effort in, he'd be on a par with his brother anyway. Do you think that's part of the psychology? I know this is all speculation, but
well, possibly. I mean, there were quite a few people who said precisely that. If only he could put the effort in, he would be on par with his brother. In fact, I think that might even be a direct quotation from letters from Flushing, which is a contemporary source about the Walcheren expedition. Of course, he never did put the effort in, so you don't know. Or if he did, he fell far short. It's rather difficult to say. But what you're left with is this impression of a man who was so used to not putting the effort in that he'd stopped even trying. But when he did put some effort in, people were blown away by how intelligent and how applied he could be. So, of course, as his biographer, I spent quite a long time feeling quite frustrated when I was researching him, because he really, if he had got up a little earlier in the mornings, he might have achieved so much. But it's one of those what ifs, isn't it? What if he had suddenly had a complete personality transplant? You just don't know.
No, absolutely. What's the family dynamic like then with his brother?
Ooh,
is there tension there?
Oh gosh, yes, there's a great deal of tension. Not all their lives. Surprisingly, despite the fact, as I said, that there was a very marked disparity between the two of them as children, which, by the way, a lot of people remarked upon at the time. So he must have been aware of that already when he was a child. Despite that dynamic, he wasn't particularly, I've seen no traces of jealousy as a child. And even when Pitt becomes Prime Minister at the age of 24, which, by the way, is overachieving much, even at that stage, Chatham isn't, he shows no sign of thinking that should be me, by the way. In fact, as I said, he's quite happy to let Pitt do all the work while he just sits there. So that goes on for quite a long time. But in 1794, there's a big falling out between the two brothers, because, of course, Pitt brought Chatham into the cabinet, as I said before. In 1788, he made him First Lord of the Admiralty. And Pitt seems kind of aware at the time that his brother probably wouldn't be the most proactive First Lord in the entire world. And he's okay with that, because there are people in the government who can help, like Henry Dundas, who was Treasurer of the Navy, and other people that get put in the Admiralty at the same time to sort of handhold Chatham while he's learning the job, because he's also only 32 and this is his first job. So, talk about going straight to the top. But of course, when the war starts in 1793, things start to get a bit different, because, of course, at the beginning of the war, nothing goes particularly right for Britain, and the Navy is also criticised a great deal, because firstly, it can't bring the French to massive engagement until middle of 1794, so that's sort of 16, 17 months after the war starts. And all the time, the French are picking off trading vessels, merchant vessels, which makes people feel quite vulnerable. And of course, the obvious question to ask at this point is, what on earth is the First Lord of the Admiralty doing? Well, of course, he's not doing anything, because he's just there because he's Pitt's brother. And this looks really bad. There are a few major disasters like Dunkirk and the loss of Toulon, which also reflect badly on Chatham. And of course, at this stage, what Pitt should have done is he should have just taken Chatham out. He should have said, right, that's it. You've had your fun. go and do something else, but he doesn't. What he does do is he gets Dundas to hold his hand a little more, in fact, you know, to actually do his job for him, which some historians have concluded that was okay with Chatham, that he was quite happy to do that because he was quite a lazy person, but he was also a very proud person. And he seems to realise quite early on that this is what was happening. And to cut a long story short, too late, they have a major bust-up, Dundas and Chatham, in November 1794 in cabinet. I don't know exactly what happened. I would love to have been a fly on that wall. I would have loved to know what actually happened, but I don't know exactly what happened. What I do know is that was the flashpoint, and that was the point at which Pitt said, right, that's it. You are now gone. But this was a year after all the stuff that had happened to draw criticism to Chatham. It was the worst possible time to do it. There's no reason to take him away at the end of 1794. And questions were asked about it in Parliament. People were saying, why has the First Lord of the Admiralty been taken away 6 months after the glorious 1st of June? Is this because the Prime Minister doesn't trust his own brother? And it made it look so much worse for Chatham. And he never forgave his brother, genuinely never forgave him. They didn't speak for months after that. They met in cabinet. I can only imagine what that must have been like. But apart from that, they didn't see each other. They made sure they took separate holidays to visit their mother, to make absolutely sure that they didn't see each other. Wow. And it was, you know, quite. Pitt's friends were very worried about it because it was clearly impacting on Pitt. Chatham was off having a huge chip in his shoulder in public. He was loudly criticising the government that succeeded, the Admiralty that succeeded him under Spencer. And it was only really sorted when Pitt, kind of as an apology, gave him a step up on the ladder in the cabinet. He had been Lord Privy Seal, Chatham, and he was made Lord President of the Council at the end of 1796. And at that point, Chatham said, "Okay, that's it. We're friends again." But it, you know, the dynamic was completely destroyed.
Absolutely. This is why making family members significant figures in government is probably not the best idea.
No, you've got to be very sure that you're doing the right thing. And well, it was a big mistake. It was definitely a mistake.
Absolutely. You can't talk about Chatham without discussing Walcheren as well. Explain to folks who perhaps aren't familiar what the plan was, first of all, with that expedition.
Well, there was a plan, believe it or not. It was quite complicated, actually. It's going to be very difficult to explain this without having a map to explain. I don't have one. I foolishly didn't provide myself with one. But if you can imagine that two islands, one of which is Walcheren, which is essentially pancake shaped, and one is South Beverland or Sud Beverland. I'm completely mangling the place names. Apologies. Which is kind of shaped like, the only way I can describe it is like a big stomach with a kind of esophagus coming off. And both of these are kind of plugging the opening to the Scheldt River, which was the main, well, one of the major rivers into Europe. Went through Antwerp, which was a big trading centre and shipbuilding centre being quite important there. And of course, Napoleon had taken over the Netherlands. He'd made his brother king of the Netherlands. And this was deeply worrying to Britain because the Scheldt was a very, very important river, and it's just opposite the British coast. And right there in Antwerp is the second, well, I think it's the second, maybe it's the third biggest. It's one of the biggest shipbuilding centres in Europe, where Napoleon is desperately building ships. Potentially with the intention of invading either the south coast of Britain or, much more likely, Ireland, because it's one of the best places to get to Ireland by sea. So the aim was to get to Antwerp, destroy the dockyards. This was supposed to be a very, very swift plan. It was supposed to be what Lord Castlereagh, the Secretary of State for War, described as a coup de main. Get to Antwerp, destroy the dockyards, destroy everything in sight, and then get out of there as quickly as possible. That was the original plan. The problem is the Scheldt River is very, very, very difficult to navigate because it's very shallow, and there are lots of sandbanks. And let's face it, the maps weren't entirely up to date. So they were essentially kind of picking their way as carefully as possible. And also the other thing you need to know about the Scheldt River is it divides into two at Walcheren. It becomes the East Scheldt, which goes around the top, and the West Scheldt, which is the main bit, which is just below Walcheren and much wider and much deeper. The idea was to get into West Scheldt with the main part of the force straight to Antwerp. This didn't happen for a number of reasons. There were supposed to be, I think, 4 separate forces. I should backtrack here and say they had 40,000 men in total. This was a much bigger operation than anything that was going on anywhere else at that time, including in the peninsula at that stage. This was meant to be the campaign. It was meant to deal Napoleon a blow from which he would never recover. So part of the force was supposed to land on Walcheren, march straight down to the main town, or the most important military town, which was Vlissingen, which we know as Flushing, which is right at the most southern point. Disable that from the land side, while the ships, the British ships, were supposed to come in and block them from the seaside or the riverside. To allow this to happen, the British also had to land another force just opposite in a place called Cadsand, which was, I think it's less than a mile away. It's very narrow. I mean, if you go there, you can see it quite easily across the water, and disable the battery that the French had there so that the ships could come in and block Vlissingen. Another force would land on South Beveland, the other island, the one that I said was shaped a bit like a stomach, and disable all the batteries that would impede the fleet's access to Antwerp. Meanwhile, the main part of the force would sneak in straight down the West Scheldt. I think it's 14,000 men, maybe I can't remember the precise numbers, but it's the main part of the force, and land at a place called Sandvliet, which is, I think, 9 miles still from Antwerp, but then they'd be able to march with the fleet technically following them and covering them as they went. It doesn't take a genius to see that this depends on a heck of a lot of different variables, and hardly any of the variables actually fell into place. It would be quite funny if it wasn't so tragic. The first thing that went terribly wrong was that the wind blew in the wrong direction, which you'd kind of expect, but they weren't really expecting it. And the entire force ended up in the East Scheldt, not the West Scheldt.
Right.
So they were in the wrong place.
That's a pretty fundamental flaw right there.
Yeah. The other thing that went wrong, which went wrong shortly afterwards, is that the force that landed, or was meant to land on Cadsand and disable the batteries there to allow because things could still have gone right at that stage had this happened. They didn't land. They were also affected by the same winds that had sent the rest of the fleet in another direction. And the commander of that force, the Marquis of Huntly, discovered 2 things. The first was that he didn't have enough boats to land the troops, which was a planning issue, which they should definitely have known before they left, but they didn't. And the other thing was that the French apparently had a lot more troops on land than he'd been told. Now, this was actually a front. The French didn't have that many troops on land. They were having a bit of fun, sort of putting as many men as they could and make it look like they had more behind the dike, because he couldn't see over the dike. So he decided discretion was the better part of valour, and he decamped without actually disabling the battery. So the only things that went right was that the force that landed on South Beveland took over the entire island within about 3 days. So that was fine. South Beveland was very definitely British. But Walcheren was a bit more of a problem because first the troops landed at the other end of the island from Vlissingen. So they then had to march all the way across the island, which was fine, but the siege weaponry was a bit more of an issue. So that took a while to get into place. And then it took them a while to set up the actual siege of Vlissingen. Of course, by this point, everything focused on Vlissingen because nothing else had really gone right. So if they really were going to get down to Antwerp via the West Scheldt, they needed Vlissingen to surrender completely. This is kind of the point that a lot of historians get hung up on. Did Chatham really have to lay siege to Vlissingen and, you know, spend so much time doing that when he could have got on with it? I'm not a soldier, so I don't know, but my feeling is from having read all the correspondence and all the there was a lot of people going over this afterwards. My feeling is that he kind of, if he was going to rely on the plan that they'd originally designed, which not being the most imaginative person in the world, he was obviously going to do, yes, he did have to make Vlissingen fall. And I can't really see how he would have managed to get across any other way without being able to get the fleet into West Scheldt to cover the force, because that was kind of the point. And the fleet wasn't getting there, it was just stuck. The wind was still blowing in the wrong direction. And of course, while this was happening, the French were absolutely delighted. They were going, oh, look, the wind is in our favour. And they were just floating over boatloads of reinforcements to Vlissingen, while the British were just standing there going, ah! And Chatham was yelling at the naval commander, Sir Richard Strawn. He was saying, why, ships, and Sir Richard Strawn was just going, wind, and there was nothing they could do. I can just imagine the French sailing across going, yeah, there's a hamster, you mother smell of elderberries. But
whatever that is in French.
Yeah, they did eventually manage to cut off the communication, but by that point it was kind of too late, and Chatham was had to get more people in Walcheren than he had intended, because he didn't know how many people there were in Vlissingen at this point. So it was a big disaster, as you can see, and you know, the plan, which I just described, bore absolutely no resemblance to what happened. So I'm going to cut a long story short again and say it was a big disaster, and it gets worse.
I was going to say, I mean, at one point when I was writing the interview questions, I was going to say that the expedition didn't go well, and then I decided that that was kind of a catastrophic understatement, because it sort of goes almost apocalyptically wrong, doesn't it? Because we also have to factor in Walcheren fever into this whole mess. Yes,
very much so. And you know, I often think that Walcheren could have been quite farcical if it hadn't actually been for what happened next with the Walcheren fever. And I think that certainly by the time that Vlissingen actually fell to the British bombardment, which it did on the 15th of August, which was, by the way, 2 weeks after they started laying siege to it. That coup de main was a bit of a limping one. By that point, I think Chatham already knew that he wasn't going to get to Antwerp, and I think that people were starting to think about what they might say when they got home, saying, well, we didn't get to Antwerp, but we did this, you know, this is okay. Unfortunately, it was kind of too late at that point. Even if they had gone home, things would have started becoming tragically wrong very quickly. Chatham actually didn't go home immediately. He kept going. Once he could get into the West Scheldt, because Vlissingen had fallen, he went down to South Beveland. He went as far south as he could, which was to a place called Butt. It's now called Butt. Back then it was referred to by the Brits as Bats with a Z. Same place, although I spent a long time looking for bats on the map and couldn't find anything, wondering why, but there you go. While he was there, some horrible things started happening on Walcheren. People started falling ill very quickly. Actually, it started on South Beverland, not even on Walcheren. It was about the 20th of August. Within about 3 days, there were several thousand men on the sick list. So it was a very sudden and very significant thing. I can't remember the precise numbers offhand, but by the time that Chatham was at Butts, and at the point at which he had to make the decision whether or not to proceed, there were about 8,000 men on the sick list. That is nearly 10% of the entire army, and that is just within 1 week. So it's not entirely surprising that Chatham made the decision to retreat at that stage. Apart from anything else, the French had already reinforced Antwerp and the surrounding area. They flooded the dikes. It was going to be really hard to get to Antwerp, even if they did try. So at that stage, it was the most sensible decision to retreat. But people were dropping from sickness hourly, almost. I mean, the sense you get from the primary sources, from the people who are actually on the ground, is first puzzlement, then horror, and then almost a sense of despair. I mean, it really affected morale, obviously, because people didn't know if they were going to be next or not. People got up fine, and were dead by bedtime. You know, it was that quick sometimes. Usually it wasn't that quick, but sometimes it was. And whole regiments were out of action. The 23rd Welsh Fusiliers were completely decimated by this. They had to be taken off active duty because only a tiny fraction of them were actually able to do anything at all. So it was a real disaster, whichever way you look at it. And of course, it was a long-lasting disaster because whatever it was that was making these men ill, it lasted for many years. It wasn't just over in a week. Even if they recovered, a lot of the men were just not able to serve, and those that did were periodically ill for years afterwards. It was
absolutely
an absolute tragedy.
I mean, I was going to ask, do we have any sense of what it actually was?
Well, I'm not the best person to ask about that because I'm not a soldier and I'm also not a medical historian. The authority on this is Martin Howard, whose excellent book on Walcheren I really recommend. It is pretty much the book on the subject, certainly the best book on the subject that exists. And he concluded that it was a mix of several diseases. And it was obviously malaria, which you'd expect given that Walcheren was very boggy. The Netherlands is still mostly under sea level. It was also typhoid, typhus, and I'm forgetting the fourth one is now escaping me, but it's the digestive system. What's that?
Dysentery.
Dysentery, thank you, yes. So he thought it was a combination of those four things. And that seems likely because one of the things that was interesting about the disease was that not everyone had the same form of it. So for some people, it would be very typically malarial. For other people, it would be more digestive system. For other people, it was a complete systemic breakdown. Their organs just failed very, very fast, and those were the ones who tended to die, obviously. So it was quite interesting, and I've read a few contemporary medical sources. It was also quite distressing for everyone to watch, because it just really was very sudden, often very violent, and there was just nothing they could do to stop it.
I mean, it's a pretty depressing topic, and this interview's kind of descended into a point of kind of depressive discussion. But I'm going to kind of turn it on its head now and talk about somebody who was at Walcheren, who, by contrast, is just a source of endless mirth. Because we need to talk about Popham. We really do.
We do.
I've gone on the record on a few interviews now describing him as a complete nut job, which I hasten to emphasize is a highly technical term. But as we were discussing before this, it's quite accurate, really. Yeah.
As I said, I totally endorse it. There is, it's a very good word for him. There are lots of words you could use, some of which I can use on the airwaves, some of which I can't. But nut job's a good one. Maverick. Unpredictable. A rule unto himself. That's several words, but it's a good one. Larger than life, also several words, but also very good. I could go on, but you get the idea.
I mean, the word that springs to my mind is sort of pompous prat, to be honest. So just give people a flavour of some of the things that you've discovered from this guy and what comes out of his mouth or comes courtesy of his pen.
Oh gosh. Well, I can't be absolutely sure what came out of his mouth, but if it's only even a fraction of what he wrote, he didn't stop talking. With Chatham, I had the problem that there wasn't very much left in the record. I had to kind of, I often described it as picking him out with tweezers from the historical record, because there'd be a hint here, a hint there. He wasn't a very prolific letter writer. With Popham, it's verbal diarrhea. It's just, oh my goodness. He was hyperactive. That's another word that I could use to describe him. He was, I don't know what his problem was, but he really had to be noticed all the time, and this meant that he was noticed. And I think one thing that you had to remember about Popham is that he's not unique. There were lots of other, so people talk about Sir Sidney Smith or Cochrane. They're very similar, but they're very different in the sense that they are well connected. Popham was not particularly well connected, and he wasn't badly connected. He had family members who were quite high up in the East India Company, but he himself, he didn't have access to some of the patronage networks that other naval people did. So the person who brought him first into the Navy died when he was quite a junior lieutenant, and he didn't really manage to get any other naval patronage, or any significant naval patronage, that I've noticed yet. So everything he did was on his own merits, as it were, and he managed to get himself noticed by people who were not in the Navy, which is kind of how he managed to rise. So there's this tension between the naval character and the non-naval character, which is going to lead me to another term I could use to describe him, which is amphibious, which of course was his expertise. He was an expert in amphibious operations, but amphibious could also be used to describe other aspects of his career, because he really was into everything. Anyone who follows me on Twitter will know I play the game Popham Bingo, which is where I'm reading a book which may or may not have anything obvious to do with the Navy or anything Popham related, but all of a sudden there's Popham. Suddenly pops up, there's no other word for it, and waves this little flag and says, hello. And that's the point at which I say, bingo. But he is literally everywhere. Omnipresent. Okay, there's another word. So many words to use. I've only got so many to actually write the book, so I've got to be quite selective. But he's fascinating. Absolutely fascinating.
He really is. I mean, the reason that I call him a nut job predominantly relates to one very specific episode of his life, where, having captured the Cape of Good Hope, as he was ordered to do, he then gets into his head that it's going to be a fantastic idea to sail all the way across the Southern Atlantic and take Buenos Aires, presumably just because it's there. There doesn't seem to be any particular reason for it. And I think I'm right in saying that when his superiors hear about it, they're sort of going, what the hell have you done, man? Sort of thing.
Basically, yes.
What was he thinking?
Oh gosh. Well, it's not as surprising as you'd think, because in fact, Popham had been working with the government secretly for several years on plans to take advantage of the unrest in South America. One of Popham's, I hesitate to say friends, certainly contacts, was Francisco de Miranda, who had been living in London for quite some time in exile. He was obviously I can't remember where he was from. Was it, no, I can't remember, but he was obviously quite well known as a South American revolutionary. Bit of a he was quite like Popham in many ways. He did a lot of different things. He even pops up as a general in France, I think, at one point at the beginning of the revolution. He and Popham concocted some plans, which they then put before the government to say, right, okay, now they weren't even at war with Spain yet. I was going to say now that we're at war with Spain. This was in 1804, before they were at war with Spain, which is part of the reason why it wasn't put into practice. If we're going to go to war with Spain, the best way to attack Spain is through their colonies, which is where all their silver comes from, all their wealth. The government was, this was Pitt's government, Pitt's second government, which came into office in 1804. The government was very receptive to this, and they made Popham draw up some pretty detailed plans about what he would be doing. I should mention that a lot of this focused on other parts of South America, not on what is now Argentina, which was then Buenos Aires. And then it all dropped through, partly because Britain wasn't actually at war with Spain at that point, and partly because the government then decided to send Popham to South Africa and the Cape of Good Hope. So it's not entirely out of the blue. But the fact that Popham then decided, after successfully assisting in the taking of the Cape of Good Hope, it's not even as though he was not needed at the Cape of Good Hope. I should say that there were rumours that the French fleet was on its way to attack the Cape of Good Hope and take it back. But Popham just decided that he wasn't needed anymore. And he left a couple of ships, and he took most of his force, and he just went straight across the ocean to South America, where he obviously took them by surprise.
Took everybody by surprise, didn't they? By
surprise, because their government by surprise. And at first succeeded with about 1,800 men under General Beresford in actually taking Buenos Aires, the city of Buenos Aires, and Montevideo, which is the other big fortress in the area. There were some historians say that the reason he did this wasn't because it necessarily needed to be done, but because he knew that there was a lot of loot to be had, and that this was entirely because he wanted to line his own pockets. In fact, there's been a book published fairly recently by a chap called, I'm going to mangle his name, I apologise to him in advance, Chris Coelho, called Pirates in Uniform, which I rather enjoyed reading, but does sail off with this piracy metaphor, I think, a little too much. Because you had to remember that Popham had already technically been semi-authorised to do something in South America by the government. So I think probably what he was thinking was, on the one side, they wanted me to do this before. They'll be quite happy if I do it now. And on the other side, and I can get some loot. So I think it was a bit of both. And of course, what he didn't know when he sailed across was that the Pitt government was no more, because Pitt died in 1806, as I think I mentioned earlier. And he only found out about this when he was halfway to Buenos Aires. He landed in St. Helena, and he discovered that Pitt was dead and that his political enemies were now in government. But he was kind of committed at this stage, so he kept going, thinking, well, if it's a great success, then they'll have to support me. And of course, they kind of did at first. It was apparently a success, and they sent reinforcements, but it was only a success temporarily, because the locals didn't like the British any more than they liked the Spanish, let's face it. And so they rose up against them, and, well, 1,800 men isn't going to get you very far when an entire country doesn't like you. Beresford's force was almost entirely taken prisoner, and Popham was, shall we say, recalled in rather a hurry. and was court-martialed for leaving his post at the Cape of Good Hope. So yeah, kind of the obvious sequel there.
How does he survive that?
Well, he's lucky again, in that there was another change of government. Although this happens somewhat, I'm not entirely sure. I think that the change of government happens after his trial. So I think probably if there were going to have been any repercussions from the trial, they certainly wouldn't have happened after the Pittites came back in. However, I don't really know at this stage why he gets off. He made a big thing in his trial about the fact that he had been given permission by the government to sail off to South America at some point in the past. And he reeled in a whole bunch of witnesses from the government, including Henry Dundas, now Viscount Melville, who had been First Lord of the Admiralty at the time. He actually gets him as his first witness, which I find smacks of chutzpah. And he doesn't exactly get Dundas to play ball with him. He asks him outright, did you give me permission to go to South America? And essentially Dundas says no, but he says it in this kind of ambiguous way. I think the precise words are no, at least not in so many words, which is the kind of thing you might expect a politician to say when actually they kind of mean yes, but they can't admit it. So I think probably I have to look into this a heck of a lot more. I think I'm expecting not to find anything, but I wonder whether a lot of what was talked about when they talked about South America was actually in person-to-person meetings, because Popham certainly refers to that a lot and Dundas confirms it. But it's very difficult to say at this stage. But my spider senses are tingling, let's put it that way.
I must say, it's always hilarious reading court-martial proceedings and watching people try and construct a defence and put in questions, because you have this kind of adversarial system, as you do in the civilian legal system, and they put these questions almost as statements. Did you not X, Y, and Z?
Yes.
And the trouble with doing that, of course, is that it opens people up to turn around and just go, no, never happened.
No, it
wasn't like
didn't.
that at all.
Exactly.
And so, so often you see the defences kind of falling flat on their face because they put this question to people and just going, no. Where can you take that? You know, no further questions, you know?
I think that did happen to Popham to a certain extent. You know, he didn't quite get what he wanted, but I think he got most of what he wanted. And I think most of what he wanted was the impression that he was working for these people. And there's no question about it. He was working for these people, maybe not specifically in taking Buenos Aires, but he had been working for Dundas for about 10 years at this point. So he and Dundas were like that. They knew each other very well. And Dundas was, I think, or had been certainly inclined to protect Popham. And I could go into that a little more because, of course, one of the things about Popham is that he had a rather shady past. And I think he needed people like Dundas to protect him from his shady past, which kept coming back to bite him. And I think he relied on just having these people turning up in the dock to a large extent to make an impression. And I think it largely made that impression. I think, you know, you could argue the toss, but I think at the end of the day, when he is, well, he's not acquitted, he's found guilty, because he was guilty. I mean, he blatantly was miles away from where he should have been, but he wasn't punished. He was given the 18th century equivalent of a slap on the wrist. He was publicly reprimanded for leaving his post. And then 3 months later, he was sent as captain of the fleet to Copenhagen. So that's not really a punishment, is it?
No. So he wasn't even suspended rank and pay then? It was quite simply a public reprimand.
Yep.
I mean, that's just a telling off, really. You're a very naughty boy, don't do it again.
Yes. Yeah, don't do it again. it's crazy. But yeah, I mean, that was kind of par for the course, really. He would get into trouble quite frequently, actually. I mean, the Buenos Aires incident is the most obvious and the most public, but it's a very rare year where you don't see Popham pouring out a whole stream of self-defense in a very long pamphlet to defend himself against some random accusation made by someone somewhere. He described himself quite frequently as being persecuted. One could say he had a persecution complex. But
and there's an interesting common denominator there, isn't there? Who is it who keeps being the target for all of these things? And I seriously think that I think from 1806 onwards, the clock was ticking for him very much. And I'm not sure how much he was aware of that, but I think all his protectors were certainly aware that there were only so many chances they were going to give him at this stage. How does he get on with Wellington?
Wellington, well, professionally they got on quite well. In the dispatches, the official dispatches, Wellington was always very, very complimentary of Popham, because Popham, of course, served off the North Spanish coast for a year in 1812. And he was quite instrumental in helping distract the French, keeping them pinned down on the north coast while Wellington was putting into place his Salamanca plans. So that helped a great deal, and there is no doubt about that, and there's no doubt at all that Popham's logistical experiments were also very useful to Wellington, and that comes across very well. However, I think their personalities didn't quite merge too well, and I think that what Wellington was saying in his official dispatches wasn't necessarily what he was saying in private. And you get a little hint of this in some of Popham's letters home, because one of the things you need to know about Popham is that he rarely went through the official channels. He liked to go straight to the top. So even though his commander was Lord Keith, who was in command of the fleet in the area, he went straight to the First Lord of the Admiralty, who at that point was the second Lord Melville. And he was writing him some quite extraordinary letters, saying things like, I tried to move the arms depot from Coruña to a place that was more convenient to me, but Lord Wellington said no.
Shock.
I could just imagine Wellington going, he tried to do what? Well, tell him he can't. I need that weapons station. So, you know, this was the kind of thing he did. And of course, he couldn't understand when people didn't like what he was doing. So he would say things like, well, you know, isn't Lord Wellington pleased with what I'm doing? I'm sure he was to some extent, but, you know, stay within the bounds of your instructions, Popham. And it's, yeah, that's just the way he was, though. As I said before, he was hyperactive, and he would just throw himself completely into something. And this made him very useful in many ways, because, of course, he was everything that Chatham wasn't. He was very resourceful. He was very good at thinking on his feet. He was very good at taking opportunities. And this had served him very well in the past. But after, you know, he gets a bit of a reputation for going too far. And I think 1812 kind of shows that, because even though he served very well, he was almost trying to show off. I think he kind of knew that it was his last chance, and he was desperately trying to show off and say, this is what I can do. Please keep employing me. And I think he just rubbed everyone up the wrong way while doing it. So he was also very rude about the Spanish guerrillas he was supposed to be cooperating with. He kept calling them brigands in his letters home to the Admiralty. In fact, someone at the Admiralty underlined it and said, why brigands? Because, you know, that's not going to help, is it?
It's really not much of a diplomat.
No.
What's it like living with this guy? Because one of the things that comes across so beautifully on your Twitter account. And if people aren't following Jacqueline on Twitter, for heaven's sake, if there's one person you need to follow within the world of Napoleonic research, it's Jacqueline, because it's just hilarious watching your kind of daily dealings with this guy. From, I mean, we've mentioned already I can't get my words out. Peak Popham, that's a tongue twister that I didn't expect to have to handle this morning. Popham bingo. You talk about Popham the ghost and Popham the fly. This guy seems to take over your life.
Well, I think if you spoke to members of my family, they'd go, yes, that's absolutely true. And it kind of happened with Chatham too, let's face it. Writing a biography is a kind of immersive experience though, and you kind of have to get it. Well, I can't say I've got into anyone's head as such, but you kind of have to live with these people and see them all the time, when they're happy, when they're sad, when they're ill, when they're at their best, at their worst. You have to be with them everywhere. And Popham is quite good at that, because he has left a sizable paper trail about his thoughts and feelings. But he is just the kind of person who, as I said, is very proactive, and he just... when it was suggested to me that I might write his biography, my initial impression was, because I mainly knew him from Walcheren, and in my opinion, he didn't come out particularly well from Walcheren. And I just thought, do I really want to write a biography of someone I don't really like? And then I swear, one day he just got on the back of my bike when I was cycling, and he just told me during the journey, he just told me all the reasons why I should write a biography about him. And he's very persuasive. So I got off the bike and I immediately wrote a book proposal. And I'm not kidding, this is exactly how it happened. And he's kind of been with me ever since. I've got a picture of him next to my computer, sitting there smirking at me. And he talks to me, I swear he does. People are now not going to want to follow me on Twitter because I'm a complete loony, but he tells me when he thinks I've got something wrong. I don't listen to him, but he tells me. He tells me when he thinks I'm not saying the right thing, if I'm not being bad enough about someone, particularly somebody he doesn't like, if I'm not working hard enough on him, he starts talking to me. I'm still here. And yeah, he's everywhere.
I mean, we were talking earlier about your children and their Lego obsession before we came on air, and we were saying what a crying shame it is that there isn't a Popham Lego figure. And I mention this now, kind of thinking, well, if he's whispering in your ear, surely he's going to suddenly think, this is a brilliant idea. I need to, take this up with the folks at Lego HQ.
It's exactly the sort of thing that would have warmed the cockles of his heart. That's all I can say. He liked to be talked about, and I'm not entirely sure that he would be entirely happy with the way I'm formulating the biography at the moment, but I think he's just going to be happy because I'm writing about him and got people talking about him, and I think that is just the thing that he loved. And the fact that I am talking about him 200 years after, it almost is exactly 200 years since he died. He died in September 1820, so, why not? The fact that we're still talking about him, that is exactly what he would have liked.
I can just imagine him kind of writing up a whole stream of letters to people, feeling so self-important that, this historian's writing about me. It's writing this lengthy book and it'll be 500 pages long and...
2 volumes at the very least.
I've got to ask, what does the future hold? When can we expect the Popham book, and what can we look forward to from you beyond that?
Well, like many people, I've not been able to get to the archives quite as often this year as I'd have liked. So it's definitely going to be at least the first half of 2021 before the book comes out. I should say I haven't written a word of it yet, but that is going to change very soon. It's all in here. It must come out. After that, well, I've got a few ideas. I've got more ideas than I did when I wrote the book about Chatham, which is good. I've got a few. I quite like amphibious operations that go horribly, horribly wrong. Particularly when there are recriminations between the military and the naval commanders. So I'm thinking that possibly a look at Tarragona might not go amiss. I've got a couple of other ideas as well, but I'm not going to discuss them right now because I told everyone what I was doing last time and then I completely changed my mind. So, but one thing's for sure, it's going to be staying somewhere around the Napoleonic period, and it's going to involve something that goes wrong because I love it. A good disaster.
Fantastic. And I've got to say, we love it. Tell everybody where they can get your first book on Chatham.
Oh, well, they can get it through the Pen and Sword website, or they can get it through Amazon. If you want a signed copy, you can also email me or contact me through Twitter. I'm quite happy to sign copies, pathetically happy to sign copies. So, you know, all good bookshops, as they say.
And remind everybody where they can find you on Twitter.
I'm Late Lord Chatham. Yes, I am Late Lord Chatham, aren't I? Yes, that's right. At Late Lord Chatham, all one word, on Twitter. Just type in Popham and see what happens.
Yeah, that's a pretty safe bet, I've got to say. Jacqueline, this has been an absolute joy. Thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me.
That was the brilliant historian Jacqueline Reiter joining me to discuss her research on Lord Chatham, the Walcheren expedition, and Sir Home Popham. And, as you've just heard, Jacqueline's book, The Late Lord, is available to order online now. A big thank you to everyone supporting this podcast, both with the likes, shares and retweets, but especially those who are sponsoring me via Patreon. If you're interested in joining my patrons, who get some neat little perks like having their names in the credits and influencing future content, you can find out more in the description link. Prices start from £1 a month, that's 50p per episode, and your contributions make a huge difference in terms of covering the expenses associated with researching, recording and producing the episode, and enabling me to produce more content than just the usual 2 podcasts a month. A particular shout out to my Mentioned in Dispatches patrons, who at the time of recording were Rob Griffith, Alex Churchill, an anonymous Canadian, Brendan Teeling, John Haynes, Anna Vakulenko, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jamie Kingston, Rory Muir, and James Bevan. If you can't or simply don't want to donate, I completely understand, but you can still spread the word by sharing the podcast with friends who might be interested, and crucially by leaving a review wherever you get your podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell to get updates on new releases. Remember that you can join the conversation online. I'm on Twitter at ZWhiteHistory and in the forum at thenapoleonicwars.net. Join me next time when I'll be speaking to Malia Ogawa about Napoleon's methods of motivating his men, and keep an eye out for a new special feature on wargaming, which will be hitting the airwaves soon. Until then, I'm Zach White. This has been The Napoleonicist. Take care, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.